is it seems like his style is, and then kind of, do a twist at the end. Is that a common? I haven't read a lot of philosophy, but I don't know. That was just, kind of.
And this, I think, it's a way of him making the strongest possible case for something, and then showing its failure.
Right.
Like, rather than weakening it continually, just build it up, build it up, build it up, and then say, here's why it doesn't work on its own terms. Or here's the extent to which it does work.
Right.
How does it work? It works this well, but it doesn't do this. So that allows him to kind of make that play.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And then I wondered about the titles. To me, the first one should have been called Certainty instead of Doubt.
Yeah.
And then this was more doubt, doubt or faith, because it's kind of all your own perception, like totally subjective. So anyway, those
or objectivity, subjectivity. But doubt is the method of doubt. Knowledge is looking at, okay, if you doubt everything, here's what you come to. If you start from the point of what you can know, I mean, because he sketches out a systematic account of knowledge.
Right.
There's nothing flawed about it, right?
That's
it's absolutely coherent. It just doesn't work at a human level, but it works internally.
Yeah.
And that's its problem, right? So it's not that it's knowledge. Like, if you want knowledge, here you go.
Yeah. But it's not satisfying either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thus the loneliness of the eye.
Yes.
All right. Ready to start? Okay. Welcome to CHI's Existential Detective Fiction. We are in week 3, Knowledge and the Loneliness of the Eye, continuing to read Fichte's classic work, The Vocation of Man. This is part 2 of that book. A little bit of review before you move ahead. Last week, we discussed the crisis that arises when humans achieve their dream of certainty, a crisis that divorces love from knowledge. Certainty, when thought consistently, means that one's status is externally determined by alien forces, leaving us mere characters playing out a long-standing script. This extinguishes that impulse within the self that longs to know its vocation, that element that loves its own life. It eliminates the possibility of freedom. The concluding sentences of Book 1 lead back then to a point of uncertainty that rejects the offer of certainty made by a deterministic vision. And again, the ending was just that heartfelt, unbearable condition of uncertainty and indecisions. The best and bravest decision of my life had to lead to you. What power can save me from you? What power can save me from myself? I mean, just a touch of melodrama. You get it, right? There's pathos in it. Like, it's heartfelt. It's strong. So that was last week. We left off at that brink of what power can save me from myself. Intro to this week, spirit comes, right? And the whole of the section is a conversation with spirit, which leads the eye through a way of thinking about existence that offers absolute freedom. Right? The crisis at the end of book 1, there's no freedom. Here, you want freedom? Here you go. And he gives all the freedom you can possibly want. It's just that this solution is just as problematic, for it severs the eye from the outside world. The basic argument is that we're only ever conscious of our consciousness. There's a permanent abyss that separates our awareness from the external world. The conversation, therefore, moves from sense impressions to intuitions like space and time, to judgments, to a self that's lost in despair, groundless, lacking a world to dwell within. So that's kind of the overall framework of chapter 2. And any other questions before we start? Here we go. As Spirit says on page 46, the goal of this conversation is, quote, not to tell each other what takes place in consciousness, as in a newspaper of the human mind, but to think the different mental events in relation to each other, and to explain one by another, and to derive one from the other, right? And so what Spirit's trying to do is not just do like a bullet point list of walk the dog, hot out, itchy, walk the dog, thirsty, like, because that's boring. Nobody needs that. What they're trying to do instead is to look at the kinds of thought that consciousness becomes aware of, like I just listed. I mean, there's sense impression. That's one kind of a thought, right? To feel hot or cold or itchy or bright or dark or things like that. I mean, the way that our senses are soft or scratchy, right? Those are sense impressions. And this one form of consciousness is just to be aware of that in the world. Another form would just be intuitions, right? Space and time, because we don't see things in snapshots, right? They're always in the flux of becoming and departing, and we get lost in those kinds of things in space and judging how far away something is, how near it. I mean, that's a little Grover. You saw Century, right? Like the near, far that Grover would do. I still love that. But we have those. We have judgments that we make. So in a judgment, according to Kant, you take a concept like dog and a percept of a four-legged, shady-looking creature, and you say, you make a judgment that says that this concept aligns with that percept, and then you judge that it's a dog, right? That's a different form of consciousness. And then a self has a different kind of consciousness or self-awareness of its own being entirely. And so the Spirit's going to try to work all of these through to show their relationships and not just give an order of things. Does that make sense? Okay. Page 27, knowledge. Fichte opens with one of the more dramatic scenes one might expect from a philosophical primer. Quote, "Depression and dread gnawed at my insides. I cursed the appearance of day which had called me to a life, the truth and meaning of which had become doubtful to me. At night I woke from disturbing dreams. Fearfully I looked for a glimmer of light to escape the aberrations of this doubt. I sought and constantly fell deeper into the labyrinth. Once, around the hour of midnight, a wondrous shape seemed to pass before me and speak to me." I mean, if only all philosophy students were so moved by philosophy as to have depression and dread gnaw their insides. I mean, to be a German in the early 19th century is no bad thing, maybe. Anyway, the Spirit takes pity on the narrator, and he says, quote, "Poor mortal, you heap mistakes upon mistakes in your reasoning and think yourself wise. You tremble before specters which you yourself have worked hard to create. Have the courage to become truly wise. I bring you no new revelations. What I can teach you, you already know. You only need to call it to mind now. I cannot deceive you. Take courage." And so what the Spirit promises is a kind of almost Platonic mode of recollection. For Plato, we can't learn anything new, right? All we can do is recollect what we've already always known, because to teach something new, it would be this aberrant importation of something that couldn't be there because it wasn't there already. So the process of learning for Plato is recollection, and that seems to be the kind of learning process that the Spirit wants to take the eye through. Does that make sense? We're not learning something new. We're not being taught anything. We're just being reminded of things that we've always already known. We just have lost our awareness of. Make sense? The narrator responds, "I took courage. The voice appeals to my own understanding. I will take a chance on it. I cannot think anything into me. What I am to think, I myself have to think." Right? So the Spirit can't possess him and have those thoughts become the narrators, right? If the narrator is going to think, if the I is going to think, those thoughts have to be the I's own thoughts. They're not going to be the Spirit's thoughts. Whatever thoughts the Spirit communicates are going to have to be thought by the narrator as a thought, because the narrator is the one thinking through them. Make sense? So this Geist, this Spirit, is not just going to possess him. It's not a Ghostbuster situation. It's just thinking, and it's safe. It's comfortable. All right? Start out with sense impressions. The Spirit helps the I realize the fact that, on page 29, I am conscious of my seeing or feeling things means that in all perception, you only perceive your own condition. That is, we cannot know what a thing is beyond ourselves. We don't see things, we don't smell things or hear them. We're conscious of color, odor, and sound. Right? So to say I see a chair already says way too much. I am conscious of black color and silver something else, right? And I can denote that there's a difference in those textures, but I don't see a chair. I see light reflecting off an object in certain kind of frequencies. And my eyes receive that. Do you see that difference? Okay? To attribute these acts of consciousness to external things is a leap that we don't need to take. The chair does not cause me to see it. I become conscious of color not because the chair forces me to, but simply because I'm conscious of color there. Does that make sense? It's a different way of thinking about sense impressions. Is that okay? Okay. As the narrator admits on page 31, quote, I sense in myself, not in the object, for I am myself and not the object. I therefore sense only myself in my condition and not the condition of the object. If there is a consciousness of the object, then it is at least not in sensation or perception. Okay, so I don't sense, like, the chair is not in my eye. I don't see chair, and I don't see the chairness of the chair. Like, it's, I can only become conscious or aware of the fact that there's color. I sense something, but it's not the chair. I sense my own sensation. That's what I can become conscious of. I sense my sense that there's light there. Is that okay? And the spirit's worried that the narrator's just going too fast, right? You're reasoning too hastily. And so they start the discussion of surfaces and what it would mean to feel a surface. The spirit's point is that you can't get to surface when you're limited to a moment that feels, right? For me to feel a surface presupposes that I can do something like that. But that's a series of motions, right? I'm feeling in a series, and I'm conjecturing that surface arises beneath that. What the spirit says is this, quote, page 34, now either you feel a single thing, in which case I don't see why you spread this simple sensation over a feeling surface and aren't satisfied with one feeling point, or you feel different things, in which case you surely feel them in succession, and again I don't see why you don't let these feelings follow each other in one and the same point. Does that make sense? This is a feel, this is a feel, this is a feel, this is a feel, this is a feel. This is just a series of feels in succession. It's not a surface. To call it surface gives it too much. Is that okay? Okay. That your hand, here the spirit continues, that your hand appears as a surface to you is just as inexplicable as that a surface appears to you at all outside of you. In other words, this is me, not spirit, the concept of surface is an inference about an object that can't be perceived. You don't feel a surface, you feel a point or series of points and extrapolate surface out of that series of movements. So what Spirit's doing here is instituting the first step of freedom that dislodges the I from being determined by the world. Rather than allowing the world to act on the I, rather than giving me a chair that I have to see, something like that, in a causal sort of way, the I becomes responsible for perception. Consciousness is the starting point of all things instead of nature or the surrounding world. Okay? And that's why it's so kind of tricky to get your head around, because we're so used to, like, oh, a chair appears in front of me. No. Too much power over the world. From the very, very beginning of this chapter, from this section, Spirit makes clear that the I is the starting point of all things. The chair does not exist until I see it. I become aware of color. I call it a chair, but there's no chair there before that's what I become aware of. I started. Make sense?
Is that partly because of language and labeling, or just because of reality?
It's twisting away from the fact that all the world imposes on me, right? And if you're not going to have the world impose on me, I'm going to impose upon the world. And therefore, I'm the one who notices this before it's there to be noticed.
You say the chair does not exist until I see it, but maybe could you rephrase that as the chair need not exist?
No, it's not even that the chair exists or doesn't exist. The chair only exists when I become aware of its existence. I don't know that there's an external world. All I know is that I seem to be conscious of something that I want to call a chair right there. That's all I know. Whether there's a thing there, whether that thing is a chair, doesn't even matter, right? I'm just conscious of certain perceptions that I want to judge as chair-like because it pleases me. But really, that's just even going too far. I'm only ever able to be aware of my own self. Does that clarify?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Page 37. The spirit moves from sense impressions and faulty assumptions based on those to questions about the background of knowing, notably space and time. And these are Kantian categories, so that's again what he's kind of reacting to and building from at the same time. It argues on page 37, quote, But space itself is not perceived, right? Nobody can perceive space. You don't say there's space there. You can't. You attribute space to the possibility that there are chairs in an empty room, but even emptiness, you can't see empty. You just see walls, and you call that space. Does that make sense? Space is something that we just automatically import into it to make it make sense, but we don't see it, we don't know it. And so, going back to spirit, and you don't understand how you became by a conception of it, and how you come to extend sensible things through it, right? I mean, this whole room could be filled with some sort of viscous jelly that's invisible to me, that's holding everything in place. But I call it empty space. Why isn't it viscous jelly? I don't know. It's space. It's empty. But the Spirit's saying we can't know that, right? We're just calling it that, but we don't know that. And we don't even know why we come to call it that. We don't know where we learn what space is. Nobody teaches you what space is. You just know it. But it's a weird kind of knowledge because it's nothing you can sense, right? And so he says, just as little do you understand how you even come by the supposition of sensible things outside of you, since you only perceive your own sensation in you, not as the property of the thing, but as an affection of yourself, right? If I put my hand on a thumbtack, I don't say that the thumbtack is sharp. I mean, I might say that, but that's wrong. I'm really saying my skin hurts, right? Something has poked me, and then I look, I mean, usually we look for a cause, but I mean, the Spirit's saying, no. There's just, all you know is that sensation. You don't know anything about the attack. You just know that your skin's been broken. Does that make sense? All you know is yourself. And he's just taking it through all these different levels. But the problem is a complex one. Even assuming that we can assume things extend in space, it begs the higher question of how do you come to extend your sensation through a space in the first place? And how do you at all come to move outside yourself with your consciousness, which after all is immediately only a consciousness of yourself, and add to this sensation which you perceive something sensed and sensible which you do not perceive? Right? If you're only ever conscious of yourself and things that impress themselves upon you, well, how are you doing all this? Like, how do you see a car drive by? There's no car, there's no drive by, there's no space, there's no out there. Like, how do we come to think this way? And at stake is the question of the kinds of thoughts we assume in order to think. Again, referred to as intuitions, time and space. We don't think time. Like, it's really hard to think time, because time is really relative and it's arbitrary in a lot of ways, right? We don't think time, but we perceive all things as temporal, coming in befores and afters, right? Whatever the clock might say. It's part of the framework of consciousness that serves as the foundation for the possibility of thinking about the world around us. Abstract thoughts require neither space nor time, right? Like, I can think the tree in general again. I'll put the tree in general back on the board, right? There's the tree in general. There's no time or space for the tree in general, because it's abstract. It doesn't need to exist in that way. But this tree over here, that does need to have time and space around it. Does that make sense? And we can't not think of things that aren't abstract without also thinking of time and space, dimensionality. Okay, that sounds right. Yeah. Okay. Causality, page 38. The I responds, but when I think about it carefully, then red and blue and the like also refer to what produces a particular sensation of sight in me. And this leads me to understand how I might at all come by a thing outside of me. I am affected. I simply know that. This, my affection, must have a cause. This cause does not lie in me, therefore it's outside of me. And again, here's the I trying to say, no, there's an external world somewhere, right? Really, like, I'm being affected by things. Forgetting, of course, all the determinism that led to the anguish and despair. He's like, no, there's something that affects me. There's a reality out there. Going back to the narrator, this is how I reason quickly without being aware of it, posits the cause, the object. The cause must be such that just this particular affection can be explained by it. I am affected in a manner which I call a sweet taste. The object must therefore be of a kind that excites a sweet taste, or it must itself be sweet. In this way, I arrive at the determination of the object. right? So the I really, really wants to hold on to causality. Again, not determinism, but to have some cause that's not within the self. And he keeps pushing back and pushing back. The Spirit always has an answer. So the Spirit says, page 40, your actual knowledge is to you an incomplete knowledge, which according to your claim has to be supplemented with another knowledge. This other new knowledge you think of as the one which you really should still have. You have no consciousness of things, but only a consciousness. Going beyond your actual consciousness by the principle of causality. So you only have a consciousness of things. You don't have the thing, you don't have a consciousness of a thing, you have the consciousness of a consciousness of a thing. That's all you have. And these things are supposed to exist and be necessary, but which are inaccessible to you. Let's call this second kind of knowledge a mediated knowledge. Right? So you can never have direct knowledge of a thing. That knowledge is always necessarily mediated by consciousness. It doesn't come to you firsthand. You always get the world received secondhand or thirdhand. Does that make sense so far? You doing okay? All right. Page 44. Different orders of consciousness. So we're going to end up talking about consciousness a lot in this class, and this is part of the existential detective stuff. So just bear with me. So one, there's immediate consciousness. Which is passive, and this relates to sensation, right? My sensation is hot, right? My skin feels hot, right? Or sweet, or bright, or something along these lines, right? There's an immediacy to that. That's not a thing, it's just, I feel myself feeling hot, something like that. Is that okay? Or I feel myself feeling darkness, right? Or seeing darkness or something. Two, there's an immediate consciousness which is active, which does the work of integration. So, like things like causality seems to be like this causes that. That comes to mind very quickly. Like the wind causes the leaf to blow or something like that. I can posit the causal relationships instantly, right? There's an immediate sense that that's so. The difference between these two really becomes important with the third kind of thinking, which is reflective. And it's in reflective thought that one becomes aware of one's own thinking, right? There's me just receiving the world, there's me judging the world, and then there's me thinking about what I'm thinking about, which is a very different kind of thinking altogether. The difference between immediate and reflective consciousness makes sense. Okay, so here's kind of the system of consciousness that Fichte is setting up. There's an absolute self-consciousness. The absolute, that produces itself and determines itself so that the I of a particular self, the empirical self, is an empirical manifestation of this absolute self-consciousness. The empirical I appears in time, but not directly. It appears in time only in the manifestation of its thinking activities, right? So we only get this empirical I when we realize that we're thinking, or when we engage in thinking. If we're not thinking, this isn't activated. The empirical I is the Cartesian I. It's the origin of thinking activities through its thinking activity, right? It thinks, therefore it is, or it is as it thinks, okay? The absolute I, which produces the self and also determines itself, and in determining itself, it limits itself by opposing it to itself. And the opposition is the relationship between the empirical I and the not empirical I, right? So how do I know what I am? In part, it's through distinguishing myself from a chair or from Jake, I mean, he also has a beard, but it's not my beard. Okay, right? And so there's a not I there, and there's a not I here, and there's a not I here, right? I'm surrounded by not I's, and the absolute I is able to understand what the empirical I is by making those kinds of distinctions. I always know what I'm not, and I can become aware of that. In the activity of producing the relationship, the absolute I produces and sustains a relationship between the subject and the object, but it itself is the unity and identity of subject and object. Right? So the not I-E, these are all the objects that we perceive in the world, right? The absolute I is able to hold in tension that which the empirical this is thinking, the empirical manifestation of I, and that which is not I. The absolute I is able to hold both of those together. It's the unity and difference between subject and object, or the unity of the unity and difference, right? So there's unity and there's difference between those, right? And the absolute I is the unity of both of those, and it's able to hold all of that together. But we can't think this I, because we're over here. But this I is big enough to also conceive of the not I and bring it into relationship to the thinking I. It just kicks it back up a step. Does that make sense? That's the kind of structural foundation of consciousness that he's thinking through. We okay with that?
So the absolute I essentially reincorporates the world of what was causing sensations to the thinking I.
Yeah, and it's able to hold that intention against the empirical I that thinks it, and to put them in a relationship that's the identity of identity and difference. Mm-hmm. Right? So there's something that's not I, but there's something that's also my reception of that is not me, that it's able to say, here's where you are and that is, and where I am and you begin. Something along those lines. Okay, page 45. Ultimately, this means, quote, all knowledge is only knowledge of yourself, that your consciousness never goes beyond yourself, and that what you take to be a consciousness of the object is nothing but a consciousness of your positing an object, which in accordance with an inner law of your thought, you necessarily engage in together with sensation. Right? I sense that that's a chair. I sense that the chair has a back to it. Do I see the back of it? No. Do I see it's underneath? No. I posit that it's there. I can't see it, but I hold that as a chair that has a bottom and a back, as a whole object, and not just a flat rendition of it. Why do I do that? I don't know. It's just what I want to do, right? And I do that because it's all in my head, according to Spirit. It's all only in my head. Page 47, search for the I. The I says, the thing is supposed to be something outside of me, the knower, right? I am the knower himself, one with the knower. About the consciousness of the first, the question arises, since the thing does not know about itself, how can the knowledge of the thing come to be? Since I am not the thing itself, how can a consciousness of the thing come to be in me? Right? The chair doesn't have self-consciousness, but I have a consciousness about the chair that the chair itself does not have. If the chair isn't me and I'm not a chair, then how am I thinking chairish? Right? It's a problem. And the Spirit responds, page 48, you are intelligence, you said. At least that is all that is at issue here. And as such, you become object for yourself. Your knowing as objective is therefore placed before you, before your knowing as subjective, and is present to this, of course, without your being able to become conscious of this placing. So when I reflect about myself, my knowing becomes something objective rather than something I'm doing, right? If the empirical I here is just strolling along like sense impressioning, right? Like hot, 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 shade, shade, breeze, hot, 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 or something like that, right? I'm not thinking about that. I'm just conscious of it, right? My knowledge isn't objective, but it's still present to me. For knowledge to become objective, it would be something more like I've been very hot today, which takes those experiences and makes it something that is true of my past. Does that make sense?
Is that reflective, or is that?
Yeah, I reflect on my series of thoughts. Yep. And that takes me out of the immediate awareness. So as soon as I start thinking about how hot it's been, I'm no longer thinking it's hot right now, because I can just become conscious of one thing at a time, right? So then I'm, like I start thinking about, wow, it's been, and then suddenly I'm not, and then I think, oh, I'm drenched in sweat, like it's still really hot. It was actually really nice today. I don't know. I think it was this weekend. I'm sort of heat obsessed. But think Oedipus. Here's the other way to do it. Oedipus the detective was the intelligence who is examining certain facts about Laius's murderer and gaining knowledge about this man, the murderer of Laius, when suddenly that set of facts seemed to align with another set of facts, his own biography. So you have Detective Oedipus, who's just gathering facts, he's becoming conscious of things. Detective Oedipus has a certain kind of personal history, or personal narrative, and then he has this case file open of Laius's murder, right? This is one objective set of facts. This is a different objective set of facts. And then this Detective Oedipus, suddenly saw or forged the connection between these two sets of facts and instantly saw himself in a new light. Does that make sense? Suddenly, this was not objective knowledge, and this was not objective knowledge that was different. Suddenly, all of that collapsed and altered what Detective Oedipus thought of himself. Right? He became a different kind of object for himself than he'd suspected that he was. And that's what was horrifying. Do you see that? Does that make sense?
That's a transformation of the empirical eye.
Yeah.
All right.
Right? And it does that because it no longer is this external objective other facts. It's a new appropriation of what this is.
So it's not the absolute I that can hold all those together that's working? Or?
Well, the absolute I, we never are, right? We're only thinking.
Oh, that's right. We can't really be the absolute. Okay.
We are the absolute I, but we never know, we never have the advantage of the absolute I. All we have is the empirical I, right? So if absolute I is the car, the empirical I is the just driver's seat. It's not the car, it's the driver's seat. But you can't go anywhere without being in the driver's seat. The driver's seat doesn't do much without the car. Is that helpful? Mm-hmm. It's a very off-the-cuff analogy.
No,
that works?
Yeah,
all right. Okay. Intuitions, page 51. Spirit says, you have penetrated to the true source of the presentation of things outside of you. This presentation is not perception. You only perceive yourself. And just as little as it thought. Things don't appear to you as something merely thought. It really is consciousness of being outside of you. You yourself are this thing. You are placed before yourself and projected out of yourself by the inmost ground of your being, your finitude. And everything you see outside of you is always you yourself. This consciousness has quite appropriately been called intuition. In all consciousness, I intuit myself. For I am I for the subjective, that which is conscious, it is intuition. Here, the spirit more fully severs the self from the world. This understanding of intuition is always reduced to the absolute I, breaking the self away from the world. Nothing in this way is ever able to be acted upon or known by the I. The I only ever finds and receives its own intuitions of itself. I don't hear an owl in the woods. I hear my own ear perceiving it, right? All I have are my own intuitions. I never have the world. I just am conscious of what I'm conscious of.
So that the tree would never fall and make a noise without the ear. The answer to that question would always be no.
No, well, I mean, there's no tree. There's no fall, right?
Good.
I intuit an impression of a tree falling. Is there an actual tree? No. Doesn't matter. I've intuited it, right? That's all that matters, is my intuition of it, not the thing itself. Is this becoming more clear as we go?
I wish I had read this first.
You can go back to it. Yeah. All right, page 54, judgments. After dealing with sensation and intuition, they begin to speak about judgments. Sensation is passive, intuition is immediate and infallible, but judgments can be wrong. The presentation of estimations, measurements, and considerations are an ordering of my manifold intuitions by the understanding, right? I can misjudge things, and that kind of poses a problem, because if it's all me, then how do I misjudge it? So the Spirit talks about the possibility of disconnect. This is page 59. He says, 1, the consciousness of a thing outside of us is absolutely nothing more than the product of our own presentative capacity. And we know nothing more about the thing than we posit through our consciousness, that is, that we produce just by having consciousness. Put otherwise, what appears to be knowledge of a thing in the world is only knowledge about what we think is a thing. And it has nothing to do with the thing in itself. Kant was famous for what in German is the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. And Kant's point is that we can't know the thing in itself. We only know it through time and space, because we can't see it beyond time and space, right? So we don't actually know what it is, because it always already comes to us processed through the manifold of intuitions, right? I mean, it's just, we can't unthink spatially or temporally. So we never have access to what the thing in itself is. It only comes through that lens. Does that make sense?
But is he at least saying that it does exist?
Yeah, for Kant, there's a thing in itself.
Okay.
But for Spirit, there's not.
Okay.
Okay. 2, once the whole realm of what is outside us only comes to be for us through our consciousness, then there is no doubt that the particular and manifold of this external world does not come to be in any other way either. And if the connection of this external world with us ourselves is only a connection in our thoughts, then the connection of the manifold things with each other is doubtless no other. So this strengthens the argument. Not only are we unable to find things, but we're also unable to know how they connect or interrelate with each other. Realize that these things get Oedipus off the hook. The connection he forged between himself and Laius and Jocasta was only a connection in his thoughts, not in reality. To be son is a way of thinking a connection between items in his consciousness that are divorced from reality. Therefore, there's no guilt, no problem. Right? He assumes these kinds of connections. No. I mean, Spirit would just say, just chill out, Oedipus. You're only connecting, making up, forging these connections in thought with these other entities in your own mind. Don't do that. There's no connection. You're just making that happen. You don't have to. It's a fiction. 3, Spirit says, and with this insight, mortal, be free and forever released from the fear which depressed and tortured you. You will now no longer tremble before a necessity which is only in your thoughts, no longer fear being oppressed by things which are your own products, no longer place yourself, the thinker, into the same class as the objects of thought issuing from you yourself. Does that make sense? Right, that's the problem with part 1. He puts the self in terms of the kinds of objects in the world which are determined by each other. And Spirit's like, don't do that, right? You're different. The objects in the world are only things that you're perceiving. They aren't there outside of your perception of them. You're not in the same class. You're a thinker. So, as long as you could believe that a system of things such as you, described to yourself, really existed outside and independent of you, and that you yourself might be a link in the chain of this system, this fear was justified. Right? As long as you grant reality to these external things, then you can see yourself as part of that chain. That's horrifying. It's like, yeah, I'd be scared of that. But now, after you've seen all this is only in and through yourself, you will without doubt not be afraid of what you have recognized as your own creature. Right? Don't be afraid of the monsters in your own mind. It's all boogeyman. I mean, just forget about it. Relax. From this fear, I wanted to liberate you. Now you are redeemed from it, and I leave you to yourself. Right? So it's like, I'm done here. You know, nothing more to see. Solve your problems. Thank you much. Good night. And this should solve the problem, but the I rejects it. Quote, is this all the wisdom for which you gave me hope? You liberate me. You absolve me of all dependence by transforming me and everything around me on which I might be dependent into nothing. You do away with necessity by doing away with and annihilating all being. In other words, he doesn't want to know that he's really in the matrix, or he thinks that the introduction of the matrix doesn't correspond to the real truth. I mean, this is the problem with the Matrix movies also, where they try to fudge the line between what was really real and apparently real and the reality underneath. But I mean, that's the problem with that, right? The spirit solution to negating dependence is to negate reality. It annihilates all being. And as long as you're willing to annihilate all being outside of your own head, nothing determines your behavior. You're uncaused. You are totally free. You just have to be willing to just annihilate all of it. And the I doesn't like that. Page 61. As I had to admit that sensations are nothing but my own inner condition, so I will have to admit that this body and its organic equipment is nothing but a sensualization in a determinate space occupation of myself, the inwardly thinking being. I will have to admit that I, the mental being, and I, this body in the physical world, are one and the same thing, only seen from two sides, only apprehended in two different ways, first by pure thinking, and the second by external intuition. So he's going through the body-mind dualism problem, right? Page 62, this explains the problem. Quote, that I feel, I intuit, I think, that I, as the fundamental reality, bring forth sensation, intuition, and thought? Not at all. Your first principles don't even leave me that much. All that I know is my consciousness itself. All consciousness is either immediate or mediated. The first is self-consciousness. The second consciousness of what is not myself. What I call I is therefore nothing else whatever but a certain modification of consciousness, which modification is called I just because it is an immediate consciousness which returns into itself and is not directed outside. The I would disappear from me at each moment and be renewed. For each new presentation, a new I would come to be. And I would never mean anything other than non-thing. All right, you see what he's saying? Like every empirical I is really just a moment, right? It's an extension of the point versus surface argument. And when the I thinks about it, the I that thinks this thought isn't the I that thinks the next thought. The words that I'm thinking, like each image, those are all different I's. There's no continuity, there's no connection. I can't prove it, right? Each new I thought brings a new I into being, a new world into being with it, but there's nothing that connects any of it. It's shattered, it's fragmented. Does this make sense?
Yeah, was there also a suggestion that like the only fact proved about all those I's is that they're not the thing they're thinking about?
That's it, yeah. There's thinking. And the scattered, I'm going back to the narrator. The scattered self-consciousness is now brought together by thought, by mere thought, and presented in the unity of an invented capacity, right? There's a fiction of an I that stands behind all these thoughts. But it's just a fiction. We don't know this I. We're only aware of each of these thoughts in succession, and we don't know that there's any connection between those. All we know is this present thought right now. That's it. And this is how I first come by the thought of the identity and personality of my I, and of an active and real power of this person, necessarily a pure invention, since that capacity and that being itself are merely invented. There's no I just invent it by thinking about other thoughts that I've had and saying, oh, there's an I that thought those things. That's it. I just make it up. When I become conscious of the need to have that kind of thought, then it's there for me to think. That's all it is. It's just another thought. What horrifies the I is that the I doesn't exist. It's only a convenient fiction that comes into being when reflecting on a series of disconnected events and thoughts. It isn't a cause of anything, right? The I doesn't cause things either. The world doesn't cause things. The I doesn't cause things. The being of the I also becomes annihilated. There's a lot of destruction in this chapter. I mean, it looks like really simple. Everything just goes out the window. Not even the kitchen sink, but also the I that thinks the kitchen sink. All right. 63. Nowhere is there anything which endures, neither outside of me nor in me, but only ceaseless change. Nowhere do I know of any being, not even of my own. There is no being. I myself do not know all and don't exist. There are images. They are all that exists, and they know about themselves in the manner of images. Images which drift by without there being anything by which they drift. And I myself am one of those images. And so what horrifies the eye is that there's nothing real. There's nothing permanent. There's nothing actual. It's all thought. 64. All reality is transformed into a fabulous dream without there being any life the dream is about, without there being a mind which dreams, a dream which hangs together in a dream of itself. Intuition is the dream. Thought is the dream of this dream. The problem, as he says, I have seen and see clearly that it is so, but I just cannot believe it, right? Totally coherent. Sure, this is great. It's clear. I don't believe it. So the Spirit offers this rejoinder, quote, hey, you wanted to know, and you got on quite the wrong road for that. You looked for knowledge where no knowledge can reach. You can't know anything outside yourself, buddy, come on. And you'd already persuaded yourself that you understand something which is contrary to the inner nature of all understanding. I found you in that condition. I wanted to free you from your false knowledge and teach you the truth. You wanted to know about your knowledge. Are you surprised that on this road too, you learned about nothing more than your knowledge? 65. All knowledge is only a depicting, and in it something is always demanded which corresponds to the image. The reality which you thought you had already caught sight of, a sensible world existing independently of you, whose slave you feared to become, has disappeared for you. This whole sensible world comes to be only through knowledge, and it is itself our knowledge. But knowledge is not reality just because it is knowledge. This is the one merit I can claim for the system that we've just found together. It destroys and annihilates error. It cannot give truth, for in itself it is absolutely empty. But you are looking for something real lying beyond the mere image, and you're looking for a reality other than the one that has just been annihilated. But your effort would be in vain were you to try to produce it through your knowledge and to grasp it with your knowledge. If you have no other means of grasping it, then you will never find it. Why is knowledge never wrong? It's empty. And it has to be empty because there's no being underneath it. All it is thought. And they're fragments. I mean, it's the dream of a dream or the dream itself. That's what you get. You want knowledge? You can know. You can know that, right? I mean, if you think about it in terms of like abstract math, like what does 2 pi r mean? Abstract math. It doesn't mean this tire, right? I mean, it means something, but it's all abstract, right? And it's never wrong that way, because it all just describes itself. It all refers to its own internal system. It doesn't refer to anything in the outside world. Does that make sense? So here are the conclusions. 1, knowledge is empty, and it's empty because it lacks a connection to reality. To attempt to find certainty is to find oneself either imprisoned within reality, doubt, or wholly severed and divorced from it, knowledge. There's a gap between knowledge and life. Does that make sense? 2. This justifies Tiresias' insight memory that wisdom does no good. To know facts about something does not allow for a better life. To understand how one understands is inadequate. What we want to know is how to live better. Part of this requires how to know better, but the best way of knowing is to know that knowledge and facts aren't everything. 3. We have a desire to know a reality beyond images, to feel that there's teeth to our own existence. We wish to have an interdependent relationship with reality, one that is neither wholly free nor wholly determined. We want connections with the reality that we consciously and volitionally participate within. Is that fair? 4. The engine driving the dialogue so far is still anguish. It's the anguish of being determined, the anger and anguish resulting from being severed from the reality of the world and the reality of the self. The I's case for itself necessarily continues into the next chapter, right? I mean, this is only chapter 2. There's a third chapter waiting for us. The Spirit concludes this chapter, though, with this thought. You have such a means. Put up some life into it and warm it up, and you will attain to complete tranquility. I leave you alone with yourself. And so also do I leave you alone in your lonely dreams of dreams. Question? Yeah.
I have a question or a comment. I don't know how to tie it together really, but maybe you can help me with your philosophy background. Does this contrast or does it tie in with like Eastern thought of, say, Zen? Like for an example of the emphasis is on space and on emptiness, and like say Zen art, say there's a painting of a tree. The emphasis is more on the space between the branches than the branches. So I don't know, does this tie in or just totally contrast?
It does neither. It's more, I mean, I'm sure that people have written about Fichte and Zen Buddhism. Like, I'm sure that there are people who have done that. I don't know Zen Buddhism well enough to articulate too intelligently about it, but it seems as though I would the foundations of thinking that Fichte is drawing upon and the foundations of Zen Buddhism does a lot with consciousness and awareness and things like that. I mean, so they're both drawing on how to think about thinking to a certain extent, and both of them are aware of some of the limitations and some of the advantages of doing that. They take radically different kinds of implications concerning the nature of reality. So Zen Buddhism looks to like a kind of detachment eventually, right? That becomes an ideal, whereas Fichte is wanting to do the opposite of that. It's a super superficial generalization about that, which is probably wrong in 18 different ways, but I think it's right enough to at least say. Does that at least respond to your question?
Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking of it because when you were talking about the emptiness also, but yeah, I could see an entire
it's kind of like apples and Ford trucks. I mean, you can make some connections between there, and you can do a great job of it, but certainly it's still an apple and a Ford truck.
Right.
It sounded like that's probably where we're going in the next, when he was talking about the energy pumping some life into yourself.
Yeah, and put some life into it and warm it up and see what happens. Yeah. So it's not going to look like Zen Buddhism either in the next chapter, because he's not a Buddhist, he's a Christian. So we get a little bit of that flavor next week.
I do practice mindfulness, from Buddhism, that thing about the I not really existing is very Buddhist.
Yeah,
just
yeah.
But
But Fichte rejects it, right?
Yeah,
I mean, he's
right.
very tied into a philosophical and ontological tradition of the persistence of the I.
Right.
So again, is there a connection? Sure there is, right? I mean, because they're both aware of these things, but they take radically different kinds of conclusions from it. Other questions? Was this helpful? I mean, did that help with the reading somewhat? Okay, that was interesting.